Hello, hello. How's your day going so far, Mike?
It's going pretty good. I took the day off of work, so it's even better than it would have been otherwise.
I hope you didn't do that specifically for this.
Oh no, any excuse I have to take the day off of work is a good one. I was too tired when I got up this morning, and it was a rainy day, and my eye was bothering me. I think it's I have a bit of allergies, hay fever, that kind of thing, but nothing serious.
Well, that's unfortunate. I hope you start feeling better soon. And, I'm really glad that you get the day off and we get an opportunity to do this recording on that day off for sure.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I appreciate you having me.
uh, I, like I tell everybody, I mean, right now in the building stages of it, I don't really see it doing a lot of good. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to come and do these conversations with me so I can build my platform.
Sure,
So
happy
starting
to
off
do it.
on that, let's go right into because I as you know, purchased Dismal Tides and I've read through it already. So I want to just jump right into how did you get started with writing in the superhero genre? What drew you in that direction?
Well, it's a very interesting story and kind of a long one. I'll try and make it entertaining, but I have been interested in comic books, reading comic books since I was about 3 years old. I got my first GI Joe comic in 1986. Um, you know, I I couldn't actually read it then, but I had my mom and dad read it to me, and then later on, I started getting involved in I started reading superhero comics intermittently, and I really got into it in the early '90s. There was a big comic book boom then. That you know sales were huge. There was a lot of speculation. Comics were big money. They were collectors items, and then around '93 or so, that kind of went kaput. So people today who weren't part of that probably think that's a little weird, but comics were very big in the '80s and '90s, and that's when I started getting into superhero comics. And I was a huge fan of Marvel, especially, but comics more generally. And over the years, I went through phases. I would be very much into them. I wanted to be an artist myself. I started making my own comics when I was a really bad artist back in fourth grade, and I'm even an even worse artist now. So, I yeah. So while I do now is I write them. I don't attempt to draw anything, but over the years I would go in and out of being interested in comics, superhero comics, and other comics. But starting in right around the time I graduated college. So this would be about 2006 or so. I started an RPG, online role playing game that basically was a mishmash of different comic book universes, with just informally a couple of friends of mine, a couple of people I met on the internet, and we started building our own universe. And I was really into world building at the time, from other previous projects I did working on fantasy and sci-fi RPGs, and I built out this alternate history, thinking that if these real if these super powerful characters, these paranormal individuals were around, that history wouldn't unfold the way it did in real life. And that was an RPG called Less Than Gods, and it was very successful for a number of years, from about 2007 till 2010, is when I canceled it. And the reason I canceled it is we were doing so much writing in it and so much good storytelling. I think that my she wasn't my wife at the time, but Shell's my wife now, but she was in the RPG with me as well, and she said, we have these really great stories, and we spend a lot of time writing them and really thinking about them and doing the world building, doing the characterization, but nobody's going to read them off this board. We can't sell them. We're using Marvel characters, DC characters, whatever. And I said, yeah, you're right. We should do something about that. But um, so I didn't really think we were going to do anything with it. I was just kind of, tossing that off. But then Shell held me to it, and she said, yeah, let's do our own original thing. And then, though I initially agreed to it, I hemmed and hawed a lot, and I said, oh no, we don't that's a lot of work, and I put a lot of work into this other setting, and I really enjoy this other setting. But over time, she convinced me, and starting in about 2011, around the time we got married, we've been working nonstop on the Ascension Epoch, which is the superhero setting that all our books take place in today. Um, and like I said, I was interested in world building from a lot of previous projects I did for fantasy and sci-fi related RPGs. And I was also very much into reading classic fiction at the time. And by classic, I mean stuff from the 1800s, stuff from the early 1900s, mainly things that were in the public domain, things that I was reading on Project Gutenberg, and also I got my first Kindle at the time. And if you have a Kindle, you want to try things out, probably the first things you're going to do are download the free books that are in public domain. I downloaded a lot of classic stuff. Some I've read before, some I hadn't, but stuff like Dracula, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, War of the Worlds, the Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan stories, the John Carter of Mars, stuff like that. And started playing with this idea of saying, hey, how about we take this public domain stuff and say, this stuff actually happened, and then build a history on that, build a, say how the different events would happen, different, especially if, say, the Martians really invaded, as they did in the War of the Worlds. And from there, we put some of our original superheroes into that world and built it out from there. So the Ascension Epoch is both, it's a strong mix of original characters and adaptations of these great classical characters especially from the 19th century and early 20th century.
So that leads directly into a question that I was wanting to ask. I noticed on your website, in the book itself, it talks about the public domain licensing for it. Now, is that something that you seem to have done that intentionally, just so that you could kind of pull bits and pieces from all of these public works like you were talking about? Uh, is that something that you want to keep doing, just moving forward with your work? Do you want to keep it as, a public space where anybody can jump in and kind of work on it and, build off of what it is you've spent your time cultivating?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, let me say it's actually, we license our stuff under Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike, which basically says that we encourage anyone who wants to reprint, adapt, make derivative works of our books, our characters, our stories, our artwork, commercially or non-commercially. We don't care. We want to encourage people to do that. And there's no requirement. They don't have to ask permission for us. The only thing they have to do is credit us. And Shell and I are strong believers in the idea that although stories have authors, they have creators, which is something that they wouldn't exist or be in their right form without. They also belong to the people that hear them, and that they mean something to. So we want to encourage people. We don't want to be like these, Paramount suing Star Trek fans for making a Star Trek movie, or Disney going after a poor family whose child died, and they won't let them put Spider-Man on his tombstone. We don't want to be rotten scumbags like that, right? And this is our way of both encouraging a fan base and encouraging people that may want to find, even if they want to take bits and pieces of our stuff and use them in their own creative works. I think it's actually very flattering, and I think it promotes a more vibrant setting and vibrant set of stories. But
Yeah, it brings more voices to it for sure, and it almost seems like an exact opposite to the Disney Paramount approach, where you've essentially put out an open invitation saying, look, here's my work, and if you like it and you're inspired by it and you can make your own work, then do it, and just make sure people know that you're basing it off of what I built.
Yes, absolutely. And the other part of that license too is that if you do that and you release your own stuff, you're obligated to release it under the same license. So you can't copyright it and restrict it yourself. And you're supposed to, you have to pay it forward in a way. And so we get a lot of good ideas from we have people that friends and so forth that brainstorm with us, but so much more if we do have a couple people who met us at conventions, and they took up the idea of writing their own stories, and they share ideas with us and we share ideas with them, and it's been very fruitful. It's a very fruitful collaborative process, and I would really recommend it.
Yeah, that seems like an amazing thing you've got going. You've totally done away with the idea of famine thinking in a way where you've created something that anybody can work off of. That's inspiring. I love that. That's amazing. Good for you.
Well, thank you. And I would say, I can't take credit. I didn't invent that. I didn't
No,
invent
of
the
course
Creative
not.
Commons
But you
license, but
chose to do it with the work that you put in. I mean, writing is no joke. Nothing about, creating an artistic work is easy ever. I mean, unless you're just wildly naturally talented, it takes time and hours and dedication to actually do it. And you've done that. And then on top of that, you said, you're open. If you find inspiration, take it, run with it. Let's continue this world. That's amazing.
and I would say, I would add to that. A lot of people say, well, how do you make money and so forth, and my response to that is twofold. One, I've never had anyone not buy my book because they could get it for free. That's just never, it's never come up.
Quite the
We
opposite. I was
yeah,
offered the books for free, and I said no. And then I went and bought it immediately.
exactly. And there's people that care about a good story. They care about art. They want to support artists because they know that they will give money to things that they value. And the other part of that is it's not it's not piracy that's keeping me from making money with my books. It's quite the opposite. It's the fact that, and this is for any independent creator, it's that nobody knows who you are. Nobody knows that you even have something to sell. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
and so getting exposure, it's another way to get exposure. It's another way to encourage people to take a look at your stuff. And it's not, it doesn't work as well as a primetime TV advertisement or anything like that, but it can't hurt, I would say.
I mean, honestly, I wouldn't even say the primetime TV advertisements are the way to go anymore. I think, like, my idea behind building this was exactly that point. There's a lot of artists out there doing amazing things, and I wanted to give them a chance to come on and get known. So when somebody
Mhm.
hears this, they feel like they've had a conversation with you, and then when they think about your work, they think, I like that guy. I would like to support him, and then they go and purchase the product. So that's my main goal. And yeah, you've nailed it right on the head. I mean, it is the way to market.
Yeah, and I think it's funny you say that too, because since we started writing, when we first put the books out, we didn't have a section in the back about, you know, um, about the authors. We didn't say anything about like who we were, where we're from, that we had kids or dogs and cats or anything like that. While our other interests were, and people always, many people said to me, it's like you have to put something like that in there, because people want to feel an affection, a kinship with authors and so forth. And I said, really? Because I never felt that way. I was never the guy who was interested in the author's bio in the back of the book, and I never really cared anything about that. So it's but I know for a fact a lot of people are, and it's I even see it when we go to conventions, and people are flattered when we offer to sign their books. And I'm like, well, of course we're going to sign. If you want us to autograph your books, of course we're going to do that. Um, and I'm not Stephen King. I'm not Dean Koontz. I'm not anybody like that. But they're really excited by it. And that's something I had to learn. It's not a natural part of my personality that people actually cared about that. But you're definitely right. People want to feel like that they know the people that they're buying stuff off of, and I
In
can
my own
understand that.
personal experience, I always thought of it as I come for the character, but I stay for the creator. I'm not going to stay and wait for a work to come out from somebody that I don't appreciate. But like as an example of what I've been in right now, Jim Butcher, I adore the Dresden
Mhm.
Files. It's one of my all-time favorites. I'm still waiting for book 16. We're 16 books into this series, and I love this dude so much. I'm still waiting for this book to drop. So that's kind of, that seems like the best way to do it. You got to get yourself out there. You have to be known. You have to have a way for people to kind of appreciate you as a person rather than just as a creator. Otherwise, they're not going to be there for those times when they have to wait for the content to come. because people's attention spans are so short. If you're just purely basing your ability to grab an audience off of when you release something, you're not going to make it in the long run.
I agree completely, and I think the short attention span thing you mentioned is a really severe problem that writers in general have to deal with today. Fewer people, if you believe the research, the surveys, fewer people in general read. Um, they're more interested in videos or video games, and it's kind of an uphill battle, even if you weren't in competition with now the floodgates being wide open and everybody's self-publishing. But yeah, so there's more and more people competing for an even smaller market. So I guess that definitely makes sense that you have to be something other than a commodity, and the way to be something other than a commodity is have people care about you as a creator.
With the writing aspect, though, I wouldn't say it's so much fallen off in exchange for videos and video games and things like this. I would say it's evolved in a way because audiobooks are so massively popular and podcasting is so massively popular. It's just gone from you having to sit down and actually read the words on a page to you being able to do whatever it is you're doing in your daily life and still consume these stories. So, have you considered jumping into that avenue at all and getting into audiobooks with your works?
But yeah, we actually do have one audiobook out, and that is an interesting story too, because when we first came out with our books, I started, my wife and I, and a friend of mine who actually who was a recording studio worker in a past job. We set up a little studio in our workplace on Saturdays when nobody was there, so it was real quiet, and we would record stories. And it was it's it's extraordinarily draining to do that. And we tried to do a lot of extra stuff like do character voices and do atmospheric music and stuff like that. So it was quite a lot of work. And we never finished even like the smallest book we ever put out. But then some years later, when I wrote Salamander 6, which is a sci-fi firefighting adventure story.
Yeah,
Um,
I just read up on that one. I haven't
so
actually read the book, but I know the story, biops or synopsis.
yep, yeah. So that of some person who at the time there was a gentleman I had not ever met him before. I never spoke to him before. He bought the book and he said, I like this so much. I want to pay for this to be made into an audiobook.
That's beautiful.
And he did. And we do have it. So we do have the audiobook of Salamander 6 available on Amazon.com. But yeah, I think for sure that we need to go try more different things. We actually do have we have an Ascension Epoch video channel in the works. We have several the narration of several videos recorded. We're just getting together some artwork and stuff to fill in so that we have something for people to watch while they're while they're watching the video. And I would like to do audiobooks. I'd like to do get a full audiobook deal for all of them. I just know that I can't be the one reading it because it's really really tedious. It's hard on your voice, and very easy to make a mistake. And then I hope I was saving every minute or so, because otherwise you're losing 10 minutes of work at a time and you got to start back over. And that's sort of the problem we had when we were recording population loss the first time.
Yeah, definitely getting the workflow down on something new like a production of that kind would be a tedious task for sure. And I can't imagine it was fun having to reread the same words that you reread over and over again. Editing them was, that had to just be mind numbing at some point.
And you would think that, given that I had written the book, that it would be easy for me to write it and not stumble over my own words and or
No,
wrong or anything. But
just the opposite.
exactly, yeah. It was very difficult.
Now, is that something that you're looking to get into within the next few years, or is it just kind of something that you want to wait until the opportunity presents itself like it did with Salamander 6?
I think it's not our primary goal right now. It is something that I do want to start to focus on, but my primary goal now has to be to get published the 5 or 6 novels that I'm currently working on. And we haven't published anything since 2016, but we've been writing the whole time. We've had a definite decline in productivity, given that we had a baby, and we just don't get to write as much as we used to. But um, we have all these stories in various stages of completion. We have, in fact, we planned on getting 2 books published this summer. The writing is done, the editing is done, but we haven't. We don't have the artwork finished, because the other part of this is that all our books are illustrated as well. My wife Shell is the she does the covers, and she also does interior illustrations. So the artwork takes quite a long time to do. The covers take quite a long time to do, and we haven't gotten to release them yet. We do want to have, as I said, we have 2 of those books are ready to go out basically when the art's done, but we still have maybe 4 other books that I would like to get finished or close to finished before we start diving too deeply into other things like audiobooks. And I think the way to do that is to, I guess I would just pay someone to do it. It's too much. It's too difficult to set up our own recording studio, and really, a lot of indie authors face this, where they want to just do everything themselves, and they have to. They're saving money, and they don't have anybody who will help them, right? So they have to just do it themselves, but that way leads to madness.
Absolutely. I mean, and it sounds like a lot of your work comes from a collaborative place. Like you take inspirations from the outside, you speak with people who aren't involved, you move around and get all these different views and opinions. So if you were to start on doing the audiobooks and just hiring it out, that would be another avenue for you to speak with a different, set of thoughts and see what they have that they could potentially bring to it that you wouldn't have thought of yourself.
Yes, and I mean, I'm not a voice actor, but I would very much like to have someone who does the character voices and who puts the extra effort into it.
As long as they don't do that screechy pixie one that's in every audiobook, every fantasy audiobook.
Yeah, I mean, there's a point at which it becomes obnoxious, for sure. So we would definitely want to avoid that.
So, in getting the books published, what does that require? Are you looking to get to like a Random House publishing or a Penguin, or
No,
no?
never.
You're looking to do it on the outside?
We've self-published all our books, and I don't foresee a situation where we would ever do anything different. The problem with having someone else, I'll say one of the big 5 publishing companies, publish your stuff. People think that that's a pathway to Easy Street, and maybe at some point that was, but the truth is that now, unless you're a really big name, they don't really promote you anyway, so you're not really getting anything extra from it. What you are getting is getting more of your money taken. You're losing your rights. You're restricted in how they decide to market your books. You're restricted in what formats they decide to put your books out, if they decide to put your books out at all after the initial print run. And honestly, I don't think any of those large publishing companies would even touch us, given our Creative Commons license anyway.
So you strictly have to come at this from an outside standpoint. So in doing that, have you considered any kind of crowdfunding devices to be able to build up the funds to get there?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that too, because Shell and I were just talking about potentially doing a Kickstarter for this next book. We were just talking about that yesterday. And it's, we would want to do something on the lower end. We're not looking for $3 or $4 million or anything like that, but something that would just say, hey, let's make this worthwhile. Maybe we can give the backers extra special editions with art packages and so forth, and maybe they'd have a drawing or something in there, and signed copies and so forth. People seem to like things like that.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Additives are always a fun thing, like posters, I mean, stickers, all sorts of things you can add on that people really enjoy.
we have a lot of stuff like that we tend to sell at conventions. We sell like coasters with our characters on them and so forth.
Ah,
But
that's crazy.
but
You don't
yeah,
have many 16-year-olds buying those, do you?
no, the funny thing is, you get people who are totally not interested in the books at all, but they're like, oh, look at these coasters, and they don't know who the characters are. you try to explain it to them because you want to sell some books and stuff too, but they're like, whatever, I just want to have, um, for better or worse, they see a creator, and that's admirable too. They don't necessarily need to like your stuff, but like, oh, I see a little creator, so I want to, throw some money their way and get some art. People like to just have art around in their house, and I can
Yeah,
certainly
and as far as
understand that.
merchandising goes, you don't want to rely strictly on your audience. You want to branch out there and sell as many of these things as you possibly can. So I don't see why that would be a negative at all.
Right. Yeah, and it's one of those things that's cheap and easy to make. I mean, we use bathroom tiles that you buy at Lowe's for like 16 cents a piece. And
Oh, are they like hand painted?
what we actually no, we basically print the image, like shell. There's something that Shell's drawn, and then we print copies of it, and we transfer the image to the tile, and then seal it
Interesting.
with polyurethane.
That sounds like a really cool process.
It's super easy to do. Like anybody who's into crafting probably has done something like that already. But yeah, it's a fun project. If maybe you just want to decorate your house, or you feel like you don't have enough coasters around, someone's always leaving water rings on your nice furniture, you could make your own.
Have you considered opening up, like little video tutorials on how to do certain things like that for other people looking to do merchandise?
Not really in the context of our books, which is the main thing that I want to focus any sort of videos on. I do. Shell has an art channel. She has quite a lot of videos on already, and uh, she does do not so much like step by step tutorials, but she does talk a lot about tricks of the trade and different techniques and things she's tried, and also like where she's failed, um, where she's tried to do something and it took her, she had a really hard time on it, and so therefore what she's learned from that. I also have a YouTube channel called Attention Span Labs that has nothing to do uh, with Ascension Epoch at all. It's more my wargaming side, and I do some crafty things on there, like build fortresses and mountains and swamps and stuff like that for Warhammer or other tabletop war games, things of that nature. In addition to talking about gaming, but I don't know how much a tutorial on that, or even like a writing tutorial, I don't know how much that would interest people. Maybe if some of the listeners for this, um, for your show here would chime in and let me know that they're interested in that, it's something I would consider. But I hadn't really thought about doing anything like that in the context of our Ascension Epoch books.
You're the first person to call for comments, and I appreciate that. Every time one of these first happens, a big smile just spreads on my face. Thank you. So, okay, in working with Shell and the two of you, I mean, your work is very much tied together. It seems, as far as the Ascension Epoch goes. If there wasn't one, there wouldn't be the other. So it's kind of like South Park creators
Yeah.
duo there, where the two of you are the most necessary pieces, and everything else can kind of go away. How have you found that in your relationship? Has that been difficult? Has there come times where you guys are just irritated at each other about work, and that drags itself into home?
Um, there have been, without making it sound too dramatic, has there been times that Shell and I have gotten into arguments about things like that? Absolutely. And sometimes it's less about a disagreement on the way things should go. um, when it does happen, and it happens rarely, but when it does happen, it's more along the lines of, gosh, I just don't want to talk about it no more. And I was so happy I wrote this, and I was happy about it. Now you're pointing out that I contradicted something I previously wrote, or what about this thing we talked about? And that can be very, it's a sort of temporary testiness that you get when you're deep into, as you mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, that um, writing's a difficult thing, drawing's a difficult thing. And so um, when you have when you think you're in a good place with something, and somebody says, well, I don't know about this, it has the potential to get your defensive hackles up. But usually that doesn't happen. I think actually it's been a huge benefit to our relationship, and not only between us. And I mean, this was something that brought us very close together, even when we um, without sharing anything too personal, when we went on our honeymoon, we did a lot of when we went up to Vermont, we would walk in the woods and mountains there, and we talked pretty much the whole time about what our characters and stuff would do, and we thought story ideas and things of that nature, and it was fantastic. We loved doing it. We, I think, you can ask Shell sometime what she thinks, but I'm fairly certain that she'd rather talk about with me with our stories than almost anything else. Certainly more than my normal day job at work, or how she had to clean up a mess the dogs or cats made during the day. And it's been I think a strength to our relationship. It's we both find creativity like a great release valve for stress. And I, not only between she and I, but I hope that in the future our son Victor loves these characters in the setting as much as we do, and I would hope that he gets involved in writing it, or drawing, or just role playing it, whatever. I really look forward to that.
Man, it occurs to me that most parents, they get to show their favorite works to their children in hopes that they'll enjoy it the same way they did. But you're going to get to show your work to your child. That's got to be crazy. What I mean, wow. What, how do you think that'll work? I mean, are you planning to kind of involve him with those stories as he comes up, like most parents would with a Spider-Man or a Batman? I mean, do you use your own work as like bedtime stories or anything?
He right now he's 2, and we read like he has favorite books that we bought. Um, None of our books are the kind that I would read to and maybe it's a 2-year-old when he doesn't really understand them. And this sort of gets back into a question we get, if I may digress for a moment, a question we often get at cons, and they're like, "Oh, you do superhero or adventure books?" Is like, "Oh, there must be for kids, right?" Like, well, not really, and it depends
No.
what you yeah. So you read the Dismal Tide, excuse me, and you can tell how there's some bad words in there, and there's
There's a level of maturity to it,
there's a
but
level of
there's
maturity.
that in everything. I mean, if you read Batman, there's tons of maturity there. If you read Spider-Man, there's tons of maturity there. But these are still the stories that people tell their children, because in a
That's
way it kind of helps them look and learn from those experiences in those books.
and yes, but I mean, you could have a 5-year-old watch Batman the animated series, and you can by the same token, a 30-year-old can watch Batman the animated series and say, "Oh yeah, this is really good." They both enjoy it.
Absolutely, yeah.
On the other
I
hand, you
love it.
wouldn't give a 5-year-old Batman the Killing Joke or something like that, where
Yeah. Not the animated one, at least.
right. And so it's by the so while I don't think any of our books are, so I should say to the listening audience who probably hasn't read any of our books, we don't do sex scenes. We don't do like over the top gratuitous violence.
I
Um,
wouldn't categorize it as NSFW in any
right.
way. I mean,
But
it's got
but it's
a
still
level of maturity, but
right.
it's not over the top.
Right. But there is scary stuff. There is sort of bad things that you don't necessarily want to fill maybe a 8 or 9-year-old's head with.
I don't know, man. My dad was reading Venom comics to me when I was still in the crib.
And to an extent, the same is true with me. Like comics were different back in the 80s and 90s, but still, I was reading The Punisher when I was like 7, right?
Oh yeah.
So it's not everybody's different, but I have to. It's just I don't think as of right now. Maybe when he's a little older, I could read books like House of Refuge, or I could read um, Population of Loss, and so the Martian War stories to him, and I could read adjusted stories like if I read say Copper Knights and Granite Man, but I left out all the innuendo from AMP out of it. I could read that to him, or I could read the East End Irregular stories with Torrent and Corona and company, if I just left out certain conversations. So that's something that will certainly happen. And then as he gets older, hopefully he likes it and he can read the whole thing on his own. The other problem with that, though, I don't think this is necessarily a problem, but um, people have said to me that I use a lot of big words, and my that um,
I have noticed that. Yeah.
the style. I've been accused sometimes in praise and sometimes in a sort of in a condescending way that I'm writing in a style more akin to some of the Victorian era books, the late 19th century, early 20th century stuff, where they use like longer sentences and more flowery speech. And I have to say that I don't think that is or should be an obstacle for children to read, and I think that um, back in the 1880s, kids read Treasure Island. They didn't read like the dumbed down, uh, you know, not that there's anything wrong with Classics Illustrated, but they didn't read the Classics Illustrated version of that. They read the real thing. Kids were reading Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff. Burroughs is not particularly flowery language, but it's still today. There's this. They want everybody. There's actually websites you can go to when you're a writer, and it analyzes the complexity of your stories, and it'll say things like, oh, you're writing at like a 12th grade level, and really you want to write your stories at a 5th grade level, like even for
Oh,
adults. And I think that's ridiculous and stupid, and I think that is a real problem for that. May be one of the reasons why fewer people are reading now. And I think it's important to not treat your audience like they're stupid. But I mean, I have gotten some comments that, if you have a really young kid, they're not going to, even if they're okay with the other subject matter, there's going to be words and stuff they have to look up. But that's okay too. I think that's a positive thing.
and yeah, and a lot of stories from a personal experience. I would say that pulled me into it. I mean, I didn't know everything that I was looking into when I started reading like the Broken Empire series. There was a lot going on there when it first came out. I was still pretty young, and I had to look a lot of those words up when I was reading into, like Lord of the Rings when I was
Right.
really young. There was quite a bit of it going on, especially the made up words where you just have
Sure.
no idea. You have to go and look it up. And I would say in fantasy, I mean, especially when it comes to people being able to create their own worlds, their own artifacts, their own reasons for certain things to take place. There's a lot of things that you have to go and look up the lore for and things of that nature. So words specifically, that seems like a silly thing to say. You have to use a dumbed down language because you're concerned about whether or not people will be interested.
Well, I think that the criticism that I've gotten on that front, interestingly and tellingly, I think has been almost entirely from adults. I've never had any like teenagers who read the books complain about anything like that. But I've had some adults complain about even the appendixes in the back. Pretty much all of our books have an appendix of some length because we're dealing with an alternate history, a completely different universe. And so we start filling in some details, like we name drop some characters, name drop some events, and they're different from the things and people that were in our real world. So there's some explanation of them in the back there. And I've had um, some adult reviewers say how they were just completely bewildered by some of that, and that they felt it took away from the story. And I'll be honest and say I don't really understand that criticism. I mean, if you don't want to read the appendixes, you don't have to. But I'm the kind of person who, like you mentioned, the Lord of the Rings. The appendixes to the Lord of the Rings are probably my favorite part of the whole book, and I love that it fills in that background, that detail, that huge history that makes the story
The
seem even.
lore, it's
Yeah, it's
it's
the
the
lore.
filler, the fluff.
Absolutely. And but I've had people that were completely baffled by some of that stuff. And I don't know what to say to them other than maybe that, I'm happy to, I appreciate you buying my books, but maybe they're not for you if you don't like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate circumstance to be in as the creator, I would think. Because you can't let them, you can't let negativity like that change how it is you're doing your thing, because apparently it is working. You've seen some success doing this as a solo artist, or solo group between you and
Mhm.
Shell. But you can't let somebody telling you it needs to be a certain way turn it into that certain way if what you're doing, I mean, don't fix what isn't broken, right?
Right. And it's less like the negativity. It's not the criticism so much. It's that once really affected our writing style between the first two books of the East End Irregular series. You've read the second one, but the first one was
Yeah.
After Dark. We got a lot of people that say, hey, I really like these characters. It was really cool. I didn't like that it was like an episodic novel, because I wrote the first book like it was as if it were a comic book, sort of that each chapter could be considered one issue back in the days when issues of comic books actually had a full story. And then I got a bunch of reviews from people who said, I really liked it. The good stories, very interesting characters, but it wasn't the novel I was used to. So that really got in my head. When I was writing the second book, I made a great effort to make it less episodic and more like a standard novel. And then I got completely different people saying, gosh, I really like the episodic style of the first book. And, the same characters in there, the story was good, but it wasn't as interesting to me as the first book with its episodic chapters. So the other thing is that, criticism's great, feedback's great, but if you're trying to write to a mythical audience, I don't think you can really do that, because you'll the old saying goes, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So you'll hear things from people and think, oh, that must be what people want. And for certain obvious things it is, right? But if you're basing it on like 5 or 6 people, and then you go and change that, you'll find that 5 or 6 other people will say that they wish you did it the other way. So you really have to be true to yourself. Now, I'm not saying to score on your fans or anything. I'm not at all taking that route. I'm not taking the Hollywood route where you make your fans out to be jerks and you say you don't want their business anymore. That's not at all the case. What I'm saying. I'm just
No,
saying
for
that.
sure.
I'm
But
just saying,
you
as a
have a
creator,
method of doing it, and you can't let these few voices change it.
right? And you have to like what you're writing. Otherwise, you're not going to write it.
So in that, which would you say was easier for you, doing the episodic nature of the first one or the more novel nature
Yeah,
of the second one?
the episodic nature of the first one, absolutely. I think I'm a much stronger short story writer, and I think that essentially being able to write interconnected short stories is a favorite thing of mine. Um, I, obviously, on the other hand, the Dismal Tide is probably my strongest book, but it's also the last book I've written. So I don't know if it's gotten better, in my opinion, because I'm working at it longer, or actually I can definitely say though I had a lot more fun writing After Dark, and some of the other and certainly some of the short stories in like the Martian War Chronicles series or something like that.
So do you think you'll continue doing it that way, or will you revert back to the episode nature?
The plan is to probably the third East End Irregulars book is going to be maybe halfway between, but in general, I prefer writing the short stories. So and I can get them done quicker. They're actually easier to plan like illustrations for, if that makes sense. Because with a novel, even a novel where there's so much going on, there's actually kind of a lot of filler, because you're filling in the gaps. Whereas a short story, you just jump from one story to the next, so you don't have as much. It's not empty space, but compared to the really high action parts of it that fill out a short story, it's less. There's less opportunity to illustrate things or to really bring up some interesting subjects. So I think we're going to go back more to the episodic stories.
That's awesome. I'm definitely going to be purchasing that first book so I can get a look at it compared to the second one at this point.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
All right, so in your work and releasing this as indie creator, how do you guys find yourself in conventions? How did you manage to work your way into that sphere? And is that something that you find is really helpful for what you do?
It depends. Conventions are very much a mixed bag. We actually decided to go to our first convention. We booked it before any of our books were actually printed, and we worked really hard. And then we had 3 books for sale, maybe even 4 books for sale by our first convention, and we did pretty well there. And a lot of people come up to you at a convention, the convention goers, I mean, and they're like, wow, they're impressed to meet, the author and the illustrator, and they think it's like a really hard thing to go to convention, but it's not. Anybody can buy a table at a convention. There are certain conventions that will vet you, and like the really big ones, like maybe San Diego Comic Con or New York Comic Con, and they'll reject you because like we have too much of this kind of vendor or whatever. But in general, there's so many conventions now, anybody can go to them, so it's not like a hard thing to fall into. You just got to have the money to pay for a table. But um, whether you're successful there or not, there's a lot of different strategies that I would recommend. But I think that if you're selling books there, you have to be aware of the kind of convention you're going to. The era of the comic book conventions where people are actually there to buy comics and like superheroes and stuff is pretty much over. By the same
Yeah,
token,
Comic Cons are really just a underground, or not underground, but a pop culture fest more than
exactly,
anything. It's no longer about the comics.
people are there much more about the movies, or they're there to see celebrities, and it's telling. You can do, there are some, believe it or not, there are some sites that do like informal research on convention, uh, the businesses that go there, how different types of businesses, how well they do. And what we found over the last several years is that it's uniformly people who sell uh, trinkets or patches or t-shirts or jewelry vendors are actually by far at comic cons, and many other kinds of cons, the overwhelmingly most successful vendors. People are selling books or even toys and stuff like that. um, they don't they're not doing as well because, to be honest, with the mainstreaming of conventions, you're attracting a lot of superficial fans, and that um, they're mainly interested in the movies. They're interested in it as a lifestyle rather than the thing they read. And even if they're interested, they may say, "Oh, I really love Thor. I love Iron Man," but they don't read the comics, and they never did. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Um, I personally don't like it, and it kind of it blocks out the kind of merchandise that I'm trying to sell. Um, but with that being the case, it becomes much harder. It's a very hard sell to sell something brand new and original that people have never heard of before, in any case, but especially in that environment, it becomes almost impossible. So what I would recommend instead is going to, picking cons that are probably more likely to have people who read and that are more interested in trying, that have not been completely mainstreamed. For instance, we've done pretty well at horror conventions, and we've done well at excuse me, at like paranormal conventions. And by that I mean the kind of conventions where the people that are there are speaking, they're like investigators of Bigfoot or UFOs or whatever, and they're taking it seriously. But there's actually a market for our kind of paranormal, weird fiction, adventure stuff there. Um, Obviously, if you're selling romance, or whatever, it may not appeal to that kind of crowd. But you have to think about the kind of crowd of the people that you're going to run into at a convention, because they're not all worthwhile. Especially you get into some conventions where they're charging, $200 a table, and then you have to think about, well, I either have to take time off of work or I lose my whole weekend, and I have this initial sunk cost for the table. I also have to pay for the books and all the other merchandise I'm going to sell there, and you really have to be careful with it. And even when you are careful with it, and even when you've had a good experience at a convention before, it's usually a crapshoot. I mean, we've had our first year at the Great Philadelphia Comic Con. It was our best year, best comic con we ever did, and we actually sold 93 books over 3 days, which for an indie author is like incredible. We've talked to other indie authors about that, and they're like, I've never come close to selling anything like that. But then we went back the next year, and we actually had 2 extra books to sell. So it wasn't just that we didn't have like new merchandise or something, but the crowd had changed, and we sold like 30 books. So it was a huge. We went from having con where we made a profit to, it wasn't worth our time going there. On the other hand, you can look at cons, if you don't look at them as a way to recoup your cost and actually make monetary profit, you can look at them as a way to spread awareness of your product. I think that's probably the best way to look at cons. You're going to be much less disappointed, in general. Like even if you go to one where all you do is pass out flyers, Maybe you go to a big con and you only sell a couple books, but you give your flyers to, uh, I mean, we've gone to cons where we've given flyers to 500 people, or we've talked to that many. That's perhaps a reasonable expenditure in terms of advertisements. It's a better, probably a better penetration than you're going to get than paying for an advertisement, especially like Facebook advertisements, which are really ineffective. So if you look at them in terms of advertising, I think they could be very helpful to an independent creator, but you have to also keep in mind too that advertising doesn't work instantly. Advertising takes repeated exposure to even penetrate people's filters. But maybe if you do it 5, 6, 7 times, people come around like, oh, I've heard of your thing before. I don't know where it is, and it's probably because they passed your table 6 or 7 times before and never really sunk in. But I think like any aspect of marketing, it's more of sorcery than the science, and nobody really knows for sure what works. But it's worth experimenting at, and occasionally you do meet. I know we've met fans, like people that came back to our table year after year, and they would get into discussions with us about our characters, and a couple of them are some of the ones I mentioned earlier on, where again, these are people we didn't know before. They're like, hey, I liked it so much, I want to write my own story set in the Ascension Epoch. And that's a great experience, and you might find that that's worth the hundreds of dollars and dozens of lost weekends you spent at a convention.
Yeah, building up that loyalty with your fans, especially by being there year after year, I'm sure is a big deal.
Yep.
All right, well, we've covered quite a few topics, and it's been a wonderful conversation. In closing, generally what I like to do is ask the artists if they have any words of wisdom for somebody who's starting out in your position writing. Do you have anything you would tell somebody who's just picking up writing and trying to give it a go and learn how to do it properly?
Well, if they're willing to take advice from someone who's not, a ravishing success at anything, I can share a few bits of hard won sort of salt to the earth, unconventional, conventional wisdom, which is just that you have to start writing, you have to finish what you're writing, and you have to put it out there. That's basically a recapitulation of Robert Heinlein's famous maxims of being an author. But I meet so many people that come up to me at conventions and they say to me, hey, how did you do it? Because I've been working at this book for 11 years. And I say, well, just finish the damn thing, put it out, and don't. And it's,
I'm sorry, that's good.
and it sounds funny, and it's common sense, but I know
it's as
that,
honest as you could possibly be.
yes, and I think there's a lot of people that are afraid, like, oh, this is my baby. If I put it out there and people don't like it, or worse, if nobody notices it, it'll really hurt me. But you know what? You have to let that go and put it out there. And even if you're not looking to be a commercially successful writer, share your writings with someone, even if you don't want to sell them, right? If you don't want to put them out, share them with people, but finish them, and don't work on the same thing forever, because I think every writer has many more stories in them than this one that they've been polishing for a decade. I think it's toxic to hold on to that. I think they really need to let it go and give it a chance, because you never know what the next big thing is going to be.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So
Thank
it's
you.
been a great conversation. I'm going to thank Shell quite a bit for introducing me to you, and I appreciate both of you for taking the time to come on here and talk about your works. And
Yeah.
on that note, I hope you have a wonderful day.
You too. Thanks for having me.